Question difficult for people to discuss is that many people have a very narrow definition of worship. Worship is just giving God all the honor God is due. And so
that is not what worship essentially is. That's a very broad statement that you could say, okay, yeah, we give God the honor. But how do we give God the honor in the way that God lays down? This is why Roman Catholics always argue against Protestants, that Protestants are essentially failing at worship because they don't have a Eucharistic altar and sacrifice. Yes, Protestants believe that Jesus died on the cross and that was a sacrifice, but they have discarded that Eucharistic centrality to worship that's ongoing at an altar. And to most pop apologists in the Roman Catholic sphere, they love to make the argument that Protestants, therefore, do not really worship God. They might have a mental assent, but the actual holistic worship, which is the entire person, the entire being of the person, this is why the liturgy, both in the East and the West, includes the whole man. It's not just a mental assent, it's also actually eating God. It's actually partaking of. It's bowing down. It's crossing yourself. It's all of these actions that are including the physical body just as much as the mind. And Roman Catholics don't even have this. For Orthodox, the heart. Keep in mind, in the Roman Catholic system, there is no nous or heart doctrine. They don't believe that. They believe in the Augustinian and Thomistic idea that it's body and soul. And for them, soul is essentially primarily identified with the intellect. So for them, salvation is ultimately an intellectual vision of the divine essence. This is known as the beatific vision. This is why for them, when they talk about worship, it's in that context of a mental assent to a vision of God's essence ultimately. That's the highest form of worship. For the Orthodox, that is not the highest form of worship. We do agree that there is an intellectual faculty in man, but we think that, as Romans 1 says, man's heart, as a result of the fall, is darkened. And the heart is not identical to the intellect or the mind. The heart is the innermost being, the spirit in man, which is why Paul talks about body, soul, and spirit. He lists three things. Roman Catholics, they only believe two. So, the whole man is deified. The whole man participates in worship, which is why we taste and see that the Lord is good. The fountain of immortality, as we sing in the liturgy. And why the whole body is involved in worship. Kissing, praying, kneeling, bowing. All of these things go into the holistic element of man being involved in worship, which is because the resurrection is not just an intellectual resurrection. It's a resurrection of body and soul and spirit coming back together after death. Thus, the body plays a key role in the eschaton and in the resurrected state. These people don't really realize that, because for them, the eschatological state is an intellectual vision of the divine essence. For the Orthodox, there's a new heavens and a new earth, and it's mirrored and patterned on the resurrected body that you see at the end of the Gospel of John that Jesus possesses. Jesus has a new body that walks through walls and that can appear and disappear, and yet he can still eat, and it still has physicality, even though it's deified flesh, according to St. Cyril of Alexandria. That's the deified flesh that we're eating in the Eucharist, which, by the way, disproves the Roman Catholics in the debate with Father Deacon Ananias, because they argue that you don't actually taste and see God in the Eucharist, because they're being consistent with their Thomistic theology that it's all created causal effects and not the actual uncreated divinity that you're participating in. I hope you see this, because all of this nonsense, the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, is simply illustrating the vast differences between the Orthodox view and these other pagan systems. And I will include Rome in the pagan systems. It should be evident now and on display for everyone, all the things that I've been telling you for the last 10 years. The entire internet religious world is able to now see this, that Rome has a severely heretical and deficient position on all of these topics. whether it's the anthropology and restricting man to a body-soul duality and leaving out the heart, or whether it is participation in uncreated grace with their official created grace doctrine, or whether it is the natural theology position that leads to the perennialism that they're all end up defending now, or whether it's the magisterial contradictions amongst the papal documents, which they ignore or explain away or just hand wave or just say it doesn't count. This is the rot of this system that I've been telling you about for so long. And people are now beginning to see it and figure it out. And they're going into damage control. And every time Cameron and his goober crew does another podcast and another stream, they just keep tripling down, and it gets even worse for them. In fact, Trent Doherty is saying that Muslims have the gospel. Wow. If that doesn't show and tell you that this system leads to this blindness and darkness, there's nothing that will tell you that.
The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit deserve honor. Refusing to honor each of these persons as God means a non-Trinitarian can't worship God. Critics also say that the Bible teaches that whoever denies the Son does not have the Father, and that pagans offer worship to demons, not God. Therefore, they say, Muslims cannot be worshiping God. But we have to be careful about taking a few proof texts and using that to answer a complicated question. Zeus and Thor do not exist, and if they have any effect on the world, that's just the work of demons. And John says the Antichrist doesn't have the Father. But in the same letter, he also says, he who loves is born of God. And
yeah, but loving is still contingent in terms of being in the covenant and having the love of God. So just saying that anyone that loves is of God is not the sense that John means it in 1 John. He's not saying that anyone, even a Satanist who loves their spouse or their husband, is of God. That's completely false.
Knows God. A person might not have God as a covenantal father, but the Bible says non-believers can have God as the creator to whom they must give worship. But before I share those verses...
But let's look at Romans 1, because this is, again, and I don't think in Trent's video he actually mentioned the Romans 1 passage. Because it's not a matter of a couple proof texts. Thankfully, we actually have an entire passage from Paul on the darkness of paganism, and that they do not honor and serve the Creator even in the pagan world, even though they should. So let's take a look at Romans 1. For the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So notice that in the pagan world, the truth is not revealed. It is not acknowledged. It is suppressed. Why? Well, it is manifest within them. Notice he's not talking about external reasonings at this point about syllogisms or Aristotle having a really supreme high IQ intellect, and that's why he got a lot further than the Amazon tribesmen did about who God is, right? It's nothing to do with syllogisms and reasoning out in some Hellenic, philosophic, Plato, Aristotle sense. It's about the universal world of idolatry that all the nations fell into after the fall, except for the covenant people who maintained the true worship of God, the only acceptable worship of God, by the way. And he says that these people had a manifest witness to them in creation that they should have come to the conclusion that there is only one true God and that he lives and exists and so forth. But did they come to that conclusion? No. Paul says they are without any excuse. According to the Roman Catholics, they're all excused. Paul says they're without excuse. Roman Catholics say, well, but they didn't know God, but they reasoned from creatures to a creator, so they are given a free pass. Paul says they're without excuse. Even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God. Now, I think, and there's different ways you could exegete this passage. Some people might exegete this as if Paul is talking about any individual pagan at any point in their life. I think Paul's talking about the original connection that man had to God in Adam, and that all of Adam's sons should have had to God had they been faithful. But since they fell, they are patterned and live after their father Adam and not after Christ. And so what happens then is that there's a sense in which, back to Adam, man knew God and had a relationship with God, but the fall led to idolatry and universal pagan worship of the demonic and anything other than God. And so that's the sense in which at one time man knew God. But we have all then fallen from that, and have not glorified or worshiped or honored him as God. Now this right here refutes the Roman Catholic Vatican II excuse and invincible ignorance arguments, because they're trying to say, well, in the case of pagans, they're still worshiping God, they still acknowledge a creator. But Paul is saying that even if they acknowledge the proposition that there's a creator, they're not worshiping and serving him in any way that God accepts, because they actually end up committing idolatry and their hearts are darkened. They profess to become wise, like Plato and Aristotle, but they end up being fools, as St. Gregory Palamas says in the very first triad. The whole first triad is about Romans 1 and the worthlessness of Aristotle and pagans' idea of God. Palamas says, did they get a couple propositions right about God? Yes. Where did that get them? Nowhere. It's demonic. He says the initiatory demonic rites of Plato, for example, got him nowhere. And the knowledge that he got of God was worthless. So, Palamas is faithful to Romans 1. Trent and Vatican II are not faithful to Romans 1. They retool and reword it to make it be the opposite of the entire point of the passage, rather than meaning that pagan darkness is what dominated the world before the gospel, or without knowledge or access to the Messiah. They make it to mean, no, actually, there's all this goodness and all of this truth in the pagan religions, and we just need to weed out a couple of the bad parts. It's the exact opposite of the thrust of the passage. These pagans thought they were wise, but they actually made themselves into fools, and they changed the glory of the incorruptible God into creatures, animals, idols, etc. So what's the punishment of idolatry? Being given over to lusts. Therefore, God gave them over to Skittles. That's what he's saying. Why? Because they exchanged the truth about God for what? For still worshiping God through idols? For still worshiping a creator? No. They worshiped and served the creature. They do not worship and serve the creator. This passage destroys all of the sophistry of these people. It's so ridiculous that we even have to debate this. In every passage that we go to, the Roman Catholics engage in the wildest reversals to make it say the opposite of what the passage says. What does God say throughout the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy? Do not go after other gods. If these people were correct, you could never go after other gods. There are no other gods because all the other gods are just imperfect worship of the one true God. But nowhere in the Old Testament at all is that accepted, and neither is it accepted in the New Testament. God gave them up to vile passions, and then you get a bunch of Skittles as the penalty, and then it says they didn't retain God in their mind. So God gave them up. The Roman Catholics saying, well, no, they did retain God in their mind. Oh, but wait a minute. Paul says that the pagans are haters of God. Oh, but they still worship the one true God, but they hate him. How do they hate him? That's why these people are saying the most ridiculous things, like Trent Doherty saying, Jake the Muslim metaphysician, the apostate from Christianity, still worships and adores the one true God who is a Trinity, even though he rejects the Trinity. That's how silly this is. This is the insanity of, like, why are we even have to debate? And so like, even having to explain this illustrates my point of the endless maze of papalism.